Our keynote speaker is Scott Bradley, and I had asked him if he could give me a little bit of summary of his resume. He declined, so I'm going to have to ad-lib, which I don't like doing. But anyway, Scott's an unusual person. At an early age, he was fascinated by the Founding Fathers, and so at age 16 or younger, he spent his life studying the lives of the Founding Fathers and studying their writings. And when I'll share something with you, how I met Scott. And I had gone to a breakfast, and there was a political panel that was discussing a certain political issue. I don't remember the issue. But anyway, Scott was on the panel, and the rest of them were state legislators and state senators, and they were supposed to address an issue. And I was flabbergasted. Scott was the only one that had sensible answers, and he wasn't even a politician. And I felt prompted that I needed to meet Scott. So I waited to the end of the meeting, and Scott was one of the last people to leave, and I met him. I stood in the doorway and met him, and I said, "Scott, we need you to run for the U.S. Senate." I didn't even know him. I can't tell you how many times I have followed impressions that I have never regretted. And Scott sacrificed a great deal. He lost his job, a lucrative job, because of Orrin Hatch's shenanigans to get rid of him. And he suffered a lot. He sacrificed a lot. But he understands the writing of the Founding Fathers incredibly well. It's a pleasure to listen to his reasoning, his arguments, and so you're in for a real treat. Scott, the floor is yours.
203,000 Americans that still care. Can you imagine? They consciously sought out a solution that was correct. That wasn't just a D or an R. And you know, I think back about that incident at Sodom and Gomorrah. There's some parallels we could draw, I think, but at any rate, I'm not going to go there. But remember the negotiation that happened, 50, 40, 30, 20. We got down to 10. We didn't. I wasn't there. But the fact of the matter is, there was hope if there were 10 good souls. In this last election, 203,000 people chose a path that would have brought a full reprieve to this nation. And I'm so pleased to be a part of that, and I think there's hope for this nation. And what we've got to do is take those 203,000 people and multiply them and multiply them and multiply them until we, the people, again, have a foundation that we can build on and insist that those that are our trusted representatives can be trusted. So Daryl and Joan, thank you for the opportunity to work with you on that, and to all of you, too. But that's not what I'm talking about today. I've never been known to be one that takes an opinion and kind of stands with it, you know. A lot of times people think I'm a little bit too hard and fast in my positions on things. I need more flexibility, more give, and so on. Hopefully you'll find that to be the case, that I am unequivocal on this position tonight. I believe truly that we are in a threat to this nation that exceeds any that have previously threatened the nation. And I don't exclude the events of the 1860s. I believe the effort today is more highly organized, more cleverly disguised, and more powerfully promoted than there had ever been an effort to completely overthrow the United States Constitution. And you're going to see that there's a whole vast spectrum of people that are actually... I need to do this.
I'm just trying to get rid of the taskbar.
Okay, okay, there we go. So, I've got the title of this, the Conference of States, Convention of States, Article 5 Convention, or question mark. And you're going to see here that there's many titles and many descriptions, and there's reasons that they've taken the approach that they have. All of which I believe is to obfuscate the threat that's currently before the United States. So let's just kind of launch into this, and we'll see where it takes us. When I was 6 years old, I was lost. I don't know if any of you have ever been lost before. It's a terrifying experience when you're 6 years old. I imagine it would be when you're 56 years old. Because when you're really lost, it's terrifying. This is a kind of a little depiction of a little 6-year-old that for the very first moment is recognizing he's lost. Oh boy, that big forest that's out there, and where am I? My first impression, which I followed, was to run. I didn't know where I was going, but I was making really good time. I got to tell you that running through the briars and the brambles and falling in the creek and dinging your shins on boulders and deadfall and everything like that does not make the solution for you. It only makes it worse. At age 6, I didn't know that when you get lost, you sit down, you look at your back trail, you evaluate your resources, you think, you develop a plan, and you keep your head. You don't panic. Now, just in case you ever get lost, just keep those handy sometime, because they'll come in real handy. But at age 6, I didn't know that. So at the very moment that it's a realization settles on you that you're lost, sit down. Well, there's many newly awakened Americans perceive that something's not right in America. They've come to the realization that America has lost its way. And that recognition results in a desire for change. Now, that's another commentary I could perhaps give, and I've put a lot of slides together to keep me on track, and I have a tendency to get off track. But the fact of the matter is that one of the things that really, really gives me hope is that although Americans voted for change, they're not getting it, but they wanted change. And that gives me hope. We not only had 203,000 that voted for Darrell, but we've got a lot of other Americans, tens of millions of Americans, that felt like they did not want where the path we're going on right now as a nation. But part of the problem is that it's being co-opted, and we'll talk about that as we go forward, because there's dozens of organizations and individuals that are demanding the time has come to change our Constitution. Example of that's the Convention of States that they bring out, and it calls for only 3 little tiny changes, just 3, okay? Now, they're the 3 little pigs because they are going to devour the whole nation. Well, the first one, now I take these, whether it's marked with quotes, I take these right off the resolutions that I've been fighting around the country. The first one is to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, a balanced budget amendment, in other words. Now, for the past 25 years, I've been collecting every proposed balanced budget amendment that I could find, every single one of them. Now, I may have missed some, but I've got a stack of them. And I have never once, not at any time, ever found one that will balance the budget. There's too many weasel words in them. There's too many loopholes. There's too many things you could drive a deuce and a half through. And in every case, they will not balance the budget. And some of them even make constitutional that which is currently unconstitutional. They say basically, if you've got the money, you can spend it. Well, that isn't the way our Constitution, I mean, they would fundamentally change the Constitution with a balanced budget amendment. Because currently, you can only spend money for powers granted in the, or delegated in the Constitution. And it has nothing to do with gross domestic product or volumes of money or anything. Ours is a limited government for limited purposes. And the way they write some of these things absolutely would fundamentally change the United States. But we don't have time to talk about all this. But that's one thing they want to do with this proposed convention. Second thing is that, and this is a catch-all phrase, and by this phrase, you could write the entire new Constitution all together over again, unequivocally, completely, top to bottom, and without fail. Because this is, by definition, what a Constitution is. They want to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. So it's a total rewrite they authorize. The third thing is limit the terms of office for its officials and members of Congress, the term limits. And again, that's one that we could spend a lot of time on. But those 3 little things are what they're calling for a convention of states. Totally and completely rewrite our United States Constitution. By definition, a Constitution is paramount to the laws or statutes enacted by the legislature limiting and controlling its power. So they want to rewrite that with this new approach. But they're just three little things. They're very innocuous, and they get them through the legislature. And right now, with Texas Action, we've got, I think, 11 states that have called for this. The Texas governor was one that fell for this and promoted it and proposed it until he got his entire state to go through. Well, who's calling for these kinds of conventions? Well, some kind of who's doing it? It's all across the entire political spectrum. And I only took a little slice of who's out there that's doing this. And some of these you're going to go, oh, yeah, I know that guy. I'll fight it because he's in it. And others you're going to say, well, they're our friends. It's just astonishing how many people have been garnered and gathered into this movement. We have George Soros, for example. Now, I know all of you are going to say, yeah, if that guy's for it, I'm against it. Well, he's working with Wolfpack. They're trying to get an Article 5 Constitution Convention against Citizens United. But Wolfpack is working all across the nation to get a Constitution Convention. We have Lawrence Lessig, a law professor at Harvard. He was a candidate to be a nominee for the Democratic presidential position. He's been seeking an Article 5 convention. He works with the Tea Party Patriots. Can you imagine? I thought they were our friends. Holy cow. Anyway, they come up a number of times in this presentation. Supports Wolfpack, and I put this last one in there just because most of you would be aware of it. He's a supporter of Better for America, and that Evan McMuffin guy, he was one that came out of the woodwork and ran against Darrell, and he is an establishment guy. Everything from being a Council on Foreign Relations mayor, but we're not campaigning against him anymore. But it's interesting how these people all tie together. You're going to see how interwoven they are. Randy Burnett, he takes more of a libertarian kind of perspective. Georgetown University, Goldwater Institute, for goodness sakes. He's calling for a Constitution Convention. He's written 10 proposed amendments, a bill of federalism. I wish there were time to talk about every single one of them and why each one of them is fraught with danger. They are. He works with the Tea Party movement to get these things happen. Oh, by golly, he's also for Evan McMuffin. So we have these interweavings. Robert Nadelson. This is a guy, former university professor, Goldwater Institute researcher, writer, and American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. They're all advocating for a convention. It's very interesting. We'll show what ALEC is here in just a minute. Tea Party Patriots. Mark Meckler is probably one of the premier faces for a Constitution Convention. He was one of the founding persons for the Tea Party Patriots. He resigned in 2012. Now he's with Citizens for Self-Government. In 2015, they launched a nationwide effort to get a convention. Advocate, total advocate, and we've testified on opposing sides before state legislatures. This ALEC has put out a handbook. They bill themselves as a nonprofit organization of conservative state legislators and private sector representatives that drafts and shares model state-level legislation for distribution among state governments in the United States. With that great title, they're out there seeking to completely change the United States Constitution. So they're out there, and you're going to run into them. And if you've got a Republican legislature in your state, you're absolutely going to have their influence because your Republican legislature's probably got people on their council. The Goldwater Institute started back in 1988 with help from Barry Goldwater. They are looking for school choice, obviously, and there's some good things in that, but they're an advocate of amendments convention. Now, back at the table in the back corner there's some of my books and lectures and stuff, but you'll find one of these, a little brochure. I brought one for each one of you. You can download this from my website. This was put out some years ago when the Goldwater Institute was making a big run at our state to get these things to happen in our state. I genericized their arguments, and I reprinted it again a couple of years ago. So anyway, those are back there, one for each of you. And again, if you want more, you can print them off at the off of my website.
What's your website?
freedomsrisingsun.com, S-U-N, like in the seat that George Washington was sitting at the convention with the rising sun embossed in the back of it. And Ben Frank, there is not. It's no apostrophes, anything. Freedom's Rising Sun. .com. And basically, George Washington, when Ben Franklin was signing the Constitution, he said that he was worried during the convention as to whether it was a rising sun or a setting sun. By the way, my cards are back there also. You can pick up a card. You don't have to remember that. But he said he had been worried throughout the convention as to whether it was a rising or setting sun, and now he had the pleasure of knowing that it was a rising sun. We can make freedom rise again in this nation. I truly believe that. But anyway, get that back there if you're interested in that. Here's one. I mean, I've sat down and broke bread with this man. I love so much of what he's done. But he now is convinced that we need to go to an Article 5 convention. You look at some of those addresses there. You look at her. Some of you have probably had her in your city talking. And she believes that nullification is a stopgap measure doomed to failure. And a convention's the long-term solution. Her only caveat is we got to get the right people there at the right time. And I'm going, well, when the Savior returns and he calls the people, I'll go along with that. And not until. And we're going to see why in just a few minutes. Okay? But look at that link there at the bottom, and you'll find that that's exactly what she says, an adult conversation about nullification and Constitution conventions. This is someone that's brought a lot of people to believe it. I didn't bring his book with me. It's a packing issue. But most of his proposed amendments would make what's currently unconstitutional constitutional. And given 5 or 6 minutes, I could probably cover 6 or 8 things that he does and just give you the superficial review of that, but we do a presentation deconstructing all of his proposed amendments. And he's made it very popular. Here's someone that you've even had speak at the Constitution Party events. He's written an entirely new Constitution. This is the preamble. I'd share that with anybody that was interested in seeing that. It's 20-some-odd pages in number 10 font. It's not just a thrown together in a haphazard manner kind of thing, but he does say we do establish this Constitution as the supreme law of the land. He would replace our entire Constitution with one that he has written. So these and many others, they're calling for a convention. And they obfuscate it with different names. Constitution Convention, Article 5 Convention, Convention of the States, Conference of States Amendments Convention. Why do they do that? Well, excuse me, they promote the idea that none of the events would be a Constitution Convention. And in fact, they promote the idea that the states would be completely and totally and unequivocally in charge of this thing. And we're going to show you why constitutionally that will not happen. It cannot happen. And because they say it's going to happen doesn't mean it's going to happen. But the fact of the matter is they say these aren't Constitution conventions. They're something softer, more gentle, more caring. Let's go to Black's Law Dictionary. It is the definitive dictionary about law terms. It says a Constitution convention is a duly constituted assembly of delegates or representatives of the people or of a state or a nation for the purpose of framing, revising, or amending its Constitution. Article 5 of the United States Constitution provides that a Constitutional Convention may be called on application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states. Everything that's there is said correctly. So what you're going to see is all those that want to call it whatever other name they want, they're seeking a duly constituted assembly of delegates or representatives of the people or of a state or nation for the purpose of framing, revising, or amending its Constitution. This, by definition, thank you, is a Constitution Convention. So regardless of what they say, oh, that's been cleared out. Good. Thank you. We made this presentation to, not this exact one, but the definition in front of some legislators in one state, and they said, well, Black's Law Dictionary is wrong. That's how much denial they're in. But the fact of the matter is, anything they're calling for falls under that terminology. It's in dozens of states that it's going forward, and a lot of good and caring Americans are being co-opted into support this. And what happens is the people that are presenting it and promoting it are people that sing the song that the choir they're with wants to hear. If you're in Utah, it's about a balanced budget amendment, because in Utah, supposedly more fiscally conservative, which is not true, but that's the belief system. In Hawaii, they want to change the Second Amendment. So they propose these things to the group with the ideas that will most resonate with that group. So many are getting co-opted into it. Here's an example. Levin's book is very popular among many people. He was known as having an association with Reagan and so on, and he's a popular radio talk show host and everything. And it's just so many people worship. I have had groups that I've presented to with hundreds of people there, and they've had his book on their table with them while we were presenting. And they come up after, but he has so many good ideas. Do you want to talk about them? And we'll sit and talk about how each one of them can be deconstructed. But he's popularized it. This is a decades-old effort. We have had hundreds of options to try and get rid of or rewrite our Constitution. There have been decades that have been fostering this, and it could completely eviscerate our Constitution. And it's gained a measure of traction in the past with certain people. And most of the people that have found that it gains traction with are legislators, because they have people like Alec and Goldwater and those other people that are promoting it to them. But the fact of the matter is, I've made so many we've had debates between legislators and me in front of citizens groups. And in every case, I have found the citizens come up after and say, you're right, we can't do this. And in every case that there's been a legislator in the room that's come up and talked to me afterwards, says, well, we might want to think about it. The only ones that are not getting it are the legislators. The people are not asking for this. And the degree that anything's happening is because there are certain agendas of special interest groups that are trying to get it to do. And we, the people, historically have been pretty apathetic. We don't want anything like this. Well, so most of the people historically have wanted to be rid of limited government, checks and balances, separation of powers, enumerated powers, that delegated power of the national government as it was founded, and replace it with a government that's foreign to what we got under the Founding Fathers and their magnificent approach to things. And so they've sought for opportunity for many decades, and they're finding that they're having an opportunity presented to them because of these caring Americans that have come out of the woodwork. We're at 28 calls for a convention for a balanced budget amendment right now. We're, I believe, at 11 for a call to rewrite the entire Constitution with Texas, what they did with Texas. So it's creeping up. When we get to 34, it says Congress shall call. We'll see that in a minute. It's gaining traction for a number of reasons. Basically, we're ignorant of what we have. And also, these issues are being co-opted, and we're being kind of brought into the fold as good and caring Americans, and we're becoming active and engaged. People that care. Remember the 6-year-old that was lost? Just running because you got to do something isn't going to take you to the end destination. The reasons have not changed. They just spin them. They're trying to manipulate a new political reality, and that's that awakened American that's out there. And that's a little bit of the downside that I have of this last election. While there were Americans that voted for change, they're not going to get it. And they're going to be extremely frustrated, and they're going to compel it. I had an hour and a half almost discussion with a guy on the phone day before yesterday, in which he says, we've got to call the question. I says, Americans don't even know what the question is, let alone what the answer is. They don't know the difference between a republic and a democracy. And he says, yeah, but we've got to force it. We've got to take the convention out there. We've got to have one, and that will force the change. We're going to see who's going to be at the convention. But they've sought to disguise it by a lot of things because they're trying to have us think that the states are going to be in charge. And they're drawing these nuanced differences, but we can't be deceived. Each one's only a slightly modified twist to change our Constitution. And it will fundamentally change the basis of our liberty and proper government. But if we change our Constitution, you think of something you cherish. Just pick something, jury system. And we could talk at length about that. We are one of the last vestiges of juries in the world. You would be shocked. Almost every nation in the world has abandoned juries. And it's one of the fundamental things of maintaining liberty. Talk about Second Amendment. The last constitution we helped a nation write was the Iraqi Constitution. And I immediately, as soon as it came out, I got 2 copies because it wasn't written in English. I got 2 different translations. Read them thoroughly. There's not even a hint of Second Amendment in there. The only right to keep and bear arms is with government agents. Freedom of speech, yeah, you've got it, as limited by law. Huh? I mean, I'm speechless. But we helped him write it, people. It's not a limited government with checks and balances and separation of powers. The last Constitution we helped write could be a template for what we'd get. Who knows? But we've got what we've got, and everything's in danger of being lost. There's so many risks. We couldn't do it. I'm not going to try and deconstruct everything here, but we're going to kind of give a kind of brief overview, as Jefferson said, going back to the way the founders wrote this and talking about it, and said instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it conform to the probable one in which it was passed. He said that it was written for ordinary people to understand. He said their meaning is not to be sought for in metaphysical subtleties, which may make anything mean everything or nothing at pleasure. I had an in-studio debate, I guess I could call it, up in Montana with some people that were absolutely unequivocally convinced that we needed a convention. 2 talk show hosts. And they had been beating the drum on this, and as we went through this on the air, they were trying to make metaphysical subtleties out of things that were in the Constitution. And their audience flipped on them. It was a call-in show. And their audience were calling in with words like, finally, somebody on this program that's making some sense. And you would be shocked at the way they responded to that. But they were just feeding their people constantly, trying to make this up. And of course, in Isaiah, the Lord said, let's reason together. So we're going to use some common sense and just look at why things are, and I hope it'll weigh on your heart, because this is so critically important, because the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity truly are at stake. So let's summarize all of the arguments that anybody could be bringing forth for any kind of convention, and it is this. They are violating the Constitution, so we must change the Constitution. Huh? I'm going to write a book someday, and I'm going to call it, Huh? It'll have to be an audio book, though, because you can't go, huh, in writing and make it make any sense. There's no logic to what they're saying. If they're violating it, we got to check. Really? Are you kidding me? There's no logic reason. The problem is not with the Constitution. There's nothing wrong with the Constitution. We just stopped applying it. That's the bottom line. And if we're the Constitution Party, we've got to help people understand that's the issue. So we got to go back to just purely applying the original intent of the Founding Fathers. We don't need to modify it or replace it. We've just got to go back and understand it and apply it the way it was. And remember, when the original Constitution Convention was called in 1787, when they came together in May, their charter said they were there to revise. And you look that up in the Webster Dictionary and that Noah Webster wrote, which was one of the Founding Fathers. We're there to revise, which is amend, the then existing Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. They did not have a charter to write a new one. They were to revise the existing one. They set it aside, they wrote an entirely new one, and they changed the ratification process. See, under the Articles of Confederation, any change had to be ratified by all 13 states. They said, we're not going to get that. Let's do 9. Now, they were honorable people. It was a high enough bar, and et cetera, et cetera. If we changed the ratification process today, what would it be? But I can't tell you how many groups I've spoken to where they say, oh, you're a fool, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. I won't spend much time on it. But 3/4 of the states got to ratify it. It's not going to happen if they're a bad amendment. We'll talk about that in a minute. But could it happen today? Could the change? Could it be ratified in another process? Possibly. Think for a moment if we had a convention today, tomorrow, next week, next year, whatever. Who's going to be a delegate? Now, do you see anybody up there that you would trust with your Constitution? I've done a calculation when you consider all current legislators in the states, all living past ones, former judges, former congressmen, senators, former administration officials, former secretaries of state, etc., etc. You can make the list. I could make 1,000 of these collages and not repeat a face. Okay, so there's about 15,000 people out there that are in the DNA gene pool that we would select for a CONCON delegate. A Tea Party Patriot guy came to me one day. I was at in fact, it was in Missouri. I was in another convention thing. I had a little booth and everything, and he came up to me. He said, "Bradley, what are you so worried about this convention stuff for?" He says, "You're going to be there, aren't you?" And I started laughing, and I says, "What makes you think anybody'd invite me?" And I says, "If I was there, I'd to my latest breath be fighting any change of it. They're not going to put me there. They're going to put those that we currently have chosen as our trusted representatives, and they will be chosen to be." And you look at that, look. If you think, we had last fall, there was a mock convention. They had 137 invited attendees. 4 of them were Democrats. That's a pretty expected dispersion, don't you think? And they suspended the rules. I've got a copy of the outcome of that here in my briefcase. Exactly, you get it immediately. They suspended the rules so they could conduct business more efficiently. And you should see what they came up with. And they only had 4 Democrats there. For those of you that think Republicans have got all the answers, they blew it. Okay? And what will happen if there's more? Well, anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. Let me ask you, how many of these are going to be there? I absolutely guarantee none of them will be there. So are we going to go with these, or are we going to go with these? Okay. What we're going to get, if you haven't looked at that film Casablanca lately, you need to go look it up again. This is near the end where they are told to round up the usual suspects. We're going to have the usual suspects there writing our Constitution, unquestionably. Well, are you willing to take a risk? It doesn't matter. There's a lot of these conference or conventions or whatever. Here's basically the method. It doesn't matter the title they're using. This is what they're expecting us to do. Let the states agree in advance through some kind of interstate agreement or compact. That's important, but what they're going to agree to. We'll talk about that in a minute. 2/3 of the states are going to apply to Congress for a convention. The states are going to get together in a convention. They're going to formalize and make the changes they've already previously agreed to, and then they're going to direct the Congress to put this forward so it can be ratified by the states. That's their process. So there's a lot of different suppositions that they have. We're going to talk about 5. Randy.
I just want to say that their fail-safe is that it takes all these states to ratify it. But you've got all those people that are already representing the states.
And they've already fouled things up. And so we're going to talk about, it's even a deeper problem than that, because the states have obviously made stupid mistakes in the past. And we're going to point some of those out. Some of them are electing the people they've currently got in there. But anyway, there's a few suppositions that they're operating under. One of those is that calling either kind of convention is constitutional, and that they'll control all aspects of the rules of engagement of that convention. They'll have a one state, one vote that they'll use as a basis of how they do business. They'll be able to absolutely control the voting behavior of their delegates from the states, and that 3/4 of the states would never ratify a bad amendment. Okay? So let's talk about these one at a time. I'm sorry this isn't kind of a rally that I'm doing, but this is something that's important for us to understand. The emperor has no clothes. The people that are doing this, they need to be exposed for being exposed. Okay, that's playing on the no clothes thing. Okay, got to see if you're still awake. Okay, so is what they're calling for constitutionally allowed? See, we do have the right to alter or abolish our governments. That's canonized, if you will, in the Declaration of Independence. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, that is to preserve the God-given rights. That's what government is for, is to secure God-given rights. It's not to redistribute wealth or any of these other things we're told about, and that's another thing we ought to talk about sometime. But it's the right of the people to alter or abolish any kind of government that is destructive of that purpose. Okay? So that was brought forth in the Declaration. That was incorporated into the United States Constitution in Article 5 of the Constitution. And it says, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall propose amendments, or on application of 2/3 of the several states, they shall call a convention. And it goes through the process of how they can be ratified. And by the way, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there's two ways that they can be ratified to come to the 3/4 states. One way is that they send it out to be ratified in the state legislatures, 3/4 of those state legislatures. Another way is to call special conventions in the states to ratify it. Here's the deal. Normally they go to the legislature. But when they found that they were probably not going to be able to get the 21st Amendment ratified, they called special conventions in the states and stacked those so that they would be ratified. That's how the 21st Amendment got ratified. That was, if you remember, that was rescinding the 18th Amendment, which should have never been put through anyway. But that's another story. So, the first constitutional method is 2/3 of both houses propose, and then they forward to the state for ratification or not. Second is that the legislatures of the 2/3 of the legislatures of the state apply to Congress. Then Congress calls, and the word is shall. It's an imperative. There's some argument by some people that say Congress will not have to call, but my position is that it says shall, and it's an imperative, and we can't get around that. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways that they can alter or abolish the government, but there's only two constitutional methods. Okay, one is 2/3 of both houses bring forth, and the other is 2/3 of the states apply, and then Congress calls a convention. A lot of ways you can overthrow a government. You can use violent overthrow, or you can do a conference of states or a convention of states or any other number of ways to overthrow this. Violent uprising, whatever. But none of those other methods are mentioned in the United States or Constitution or authorized in it. There's only two methods that are authorized constitutionally. So there's no constitutional authority for the states to independently gather and somehow bring forth things that they say should be changed in the Constitution. This is what's being proposed in the Convention of States and Conference of States people. And it's interesting to me that Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution prohibits the states from entering into an agreement or a compact with another state without the consent of Congress. Here's what it says. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state. It's a complete prohibition for them to do that. So we've got to ask ourselves, what are the chances Congress will turn a blind eye, acquiesce, say, oh yeah, go ahead, whatever. Something that was delegated to the Congress. The chances are slim and none. They are not going to do that. So the Constitution may be only altered when 2/3 of both houses propose an amendment or 2/3 of the legislatures apply and Congress calls. Now we're going to see in supposition number 2 why Congress calling is such an imperative thing we understand. What they're saying is that the states will be able to control everything that happens once they call a convention, once they call it. Well, let's look at the realities. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. Now, I would have had you all looking through your constitutions, and it would have taken me longer to present than I am right now. Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. Okay, this is called the necessary and proper clause. It's not the elastic clause, as a lot of people say, where they say, well, from that clause we can go and do anything we darn well please because it's kind of open-ended. That's not the case. We'll read it again here in a moment, and it's portions that we need to understand. So it grants to Congress the powers that are necessary to carry out the powers that are delegated to it. That's all that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 does. And let's take an example. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5. Congress has power to coin money. Well, that's all it says, okay? This Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 says that they have the power to carry out all that's necessary to coin money, okay? That includes building a mint, doing job descriptions, creating employment requirements, staffing the mint, paying the staff, designing and creating the coins, or as we say, the Coinage Act of 1792. See, they have the power to coin money, but they have the power to do all the things that are necessary to bring forth the coined money. So here in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, Congress shall have power to carry into execution the foregoing powers. So all of Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 1 through 17, they can carry those out. And all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. Well, Article 5 delegates to Congress the power to call a convention upon application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states. It says the Congress, on application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. So we've got to assume that the Congress, just like in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5,
But Article 5 comes after Article 1, and Article 1 says the foregoing.
But it also says
and all others. It does, and we'll look at that. Okay, so we must assume that they'll have all prerogative powers associated with that. So that includes the location of the convention, the rules under the convention to operate, the delegate allocation, the voting procedures, the agenda, and all those other things. Okay, do you want to go back and read that again, or should we? Or do you guys remember it says all the other ones too? You're good with that? Okay, because it does actually say any of the other things that are done in the Constitution. So the rules of engagement will likely be dictated by the Congress, and Congress in this case is again not likely to acquiesce. Okay, interestingly, and I have copies of these up here in case you want to look at them, and you can find them on the internet. On 3 different occasions, and they're substantive documents. The Congressional Research Service has reviewed, and they're the think tank for the Congress, a nonpartisan think tank, and they have reviewed the issues of a convention where it come up. And they have published their reviews at the request of Congress. And they fairly review all the options. They say, well, some believe this, some believe that, and here's the points on this, and this is likely where it would go. So they kind of summarize it. They largely embrace the things I'm talking about here this evening. So the Congress is probably going to use this as the guide when a convention becomes likely. So the things I'm talking about here come out of the Congressional Research Service admonitions that they give to Congress. One time I was testifying before a legislative body, and I made comment to this effect, and the chair of the committee said, well, that doesn't mean Congress has to follow it. I says, well, you probably ought to know what their think tank is saying, though. So they sent from their august station down to me in the witness stand one of their aides to get these to make copies for all of the people on the committee. And the guy leaned over to me and he says, I used to work for the Congressional Research Service. He says, Congress has very high regard for their position, and they do listen to them, in spite of what some of these legislators might have said. So, it's very likely that what's admonished in these researchers' papers will probably follow. Supposition number 3, they're going to set the rules of engagement, and it will be one state, one vote. And that their logic and reason is that, well, that's how they did it in 1787, and so we'll just replicate that. Well, in today's democracy-prone world, this is going to be absolutely resisted by the states with large populations. So let's take an example. California has over 38 million people. Wyoming has less than 600,000. Okay? Now, can you see Feinstein or Brown, or well, you pick the names of who you're thinking about? What are the chances that California is going to say, it's okay, Wyoming residents each, in effect, get 63 times more power in this convention than each one of our residents does? Can you see that happening? 2 chances, slim and none. Okay? That will not happen. And Congress will surely feel a need to intervene and correct this inequality that is going to happen. And honestly, what they've come up with is that the best scenario for those of us that are in smaller states is to distribute the votes by electoral votes. That's probably what would be approved by Congress. California would then have 55 votes, Wyoming 3. Sorry about that, Daniel. New York 29, and so on. You can read on there what would be those, and so on and so forth. You probably know what each one of your states have. But that electoral college voting model is what was suggested by the Congressional Research Service. But it even could get worse than that. They said another scenario that might be more acceptable to the larger states is go strictly by population. And that way, if Wyoming got 1 vote, we'd be shocked. Okay? Because there's going to have to be, well, they'd have to get one if they were going to get anything, but the fact of the matter is, if they went strictly by population, the Electoral College skewing it slightly in favor of the smaller states would go away. So then supposition number 4, they say the voting delegates will be completely controlled by the states. How are they going to do that? Well, a number of different ways. Some that I've seen is where they're going to give voting instructions to their delegates. One's going to do a delegate recall by their state. My state has stupidly taken this approach. So they're going to use our call for a convention to get a convention going, and then if they get in it and find out it's not going the way they like, they're going to recall their delegates. So they leave Utah without a voice. It's brilliant. And that's not going to close the convention down. And in fact, we have examples in the original convention of 1787 where some states pulled out during the middle of the convention. And the convention went on. Well, some of them are predefining penalties. Some are misdemeanors, some are felonies, some are fines, and some are prison terms. And the fact of the matter is that there's a high probability that they'll write protection rules that parallels what's in Article 1, Section 6, and this is what it says there. Speaking of the congressmen and senators, they shall in all cases except treason, felony, and breach of peace be privileged from arrest during their attendance at the session of their respective houses, and in going to and returning from the same, and for any speech or debate in either house, they shall not be questioned in any other place. Okay, so this is kind of weird. They've already suggested that's a solution in the Congressional Research Service. They're going to suggest that Congress, when they call a convention, they protect the delegates, so they cannot be penalized in any other way. What about the pardon, if that was not in there? A president or a governor can pardon them. And you can see from Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, the president has the power of pardon. What about some wealthy benefactor? You saw George Soros' face come up earlier. What if he liked the outcome and he says, I'll pay your fines? Well, if you're put in prison, I'll keep your family. I mean, if they get the outcome they want, who knows? Okay? Okay, now supposition number 5. 3/4 of the states would not ratify a bad amendment. Remember, the original one said they're called to revise, and they wrote a new one. They changed the ratification process. Okay? Could it happen? Probably. Would it happen? Who knows? I'm not willing to risk it. But talk about never ratifying bad amendments. I just put 4 up here. There's others we could easily discuss, but the 14th Amendment, the most litigated amendment. Now, by the way, if you ever contact me if you're interested in seeing what an august body such as the Utah Supreme Court reviewed the ratification process of the 14th Amendment as one of their cases. It was just kind of supplemental to what they were reviewing in the case. My goodness, there really were tyrants. They were called Republicans after the Civil War. They did some horrid shenanigans to get the 14th Amendment brought forward. And it was interesting to me, they kicked people in and out of the Union just to get their vote. 16th Amendment, now that's one that's had a happy ever after ending. 17th Amendment, direct election of the senators, which, by the way, violates Article 5 of the Constitution still. And we could talk about that at some length if you wished. 18th Amendment, prohibition, as I said, should never have been ratified. The states have ratified bad amendments. And there's no guarantee we're not going to be duped again, or they could change that ratification threshold. So, old nursery rhyme, if wishes were horses, beggars would ride. All that wishful thinking that these guys that want things does not assure the correctness of their position. Whether you call it any of the things we've talked about, there's no proposed amendments that are going to solve the problems, and there's no convention necessary or will solve the problems. And if we do call one, these are the people, or people of their ilk, or who's going to be there. Yeah. And none of these will be there. We're just going to have the usual suspects. Okay. So the solution is to return to our well-marked back trail. We got to insist that our representatives go back to their enumerated powers that are spelled out in the Constitution. Remember the lost rules? Sit down, look at your back trail, evaluate your resources, think, develop a plan, keep your head, don't panic. We have all the things necessary to find our way back home. It still exists. Absolutely, unequivocally, we can find it. So sit down and think about it. The Constitution's our solution. And when we do restore that, we'll become again the greatest, freest, most prosperous, most respected nation on earth. And I just want to kind of end with something that some of you here may remember. If you weren't there, at least you have heard of it. 49 years ago, there was a Tet Offensive in Southeast Asia. There were simultaneous attacks on over 100 cities and towns by over 80,000 communists. It was the largest military operation to date that had happened in that war. So, it was highly organized, it was cleverly disguised, it was powerfully promoted, and it was carried out devastatingly. Now, most of you that track these kind of things know that they didn't succeed. We proved that they were incapable of carrying the battle. I pray that that's the case today, because you saw the spectrum of people that they have on their side. Our friends are few at this point. You know, you look at the John Birch Society, or you look at Eagle Forum, you look at the Constitution Party, and you regardless, I mean, the big names are not out there. But the cause is just, and we must continue and go forward and take care of this. There was a little event that happened during the Tet Offensive. Now, my Vietnamese is approaching 50 years old. 47, okay. Anyway, so it's terrible. But Bon Trois was a little town down on the Mekong Delta that was overrun by the communist forces. And here's what one Army major stated in a statement that he made on the 7th of February 1968. He said, "It became necessary to destroy the town to save it." They're violating our Constitution, so we've got to change it. We can't be tricked into destroying the Constitution to save it. Bon Trois was not saved by that action when it was bombed back into the Dark Ages by artillery and air power. It was obliterated. Now, we've got to reject any call for a convention. I don't care what they call it. We've got to reject any call for it. There's just way too much danger, and as you can see, that we can probably not be sure that the promises they've made us are going to be likely. So we've got to go back to the limits and bounds. We've got to go back to the plain English words. We've just abandoned the plain English words. They're written in English. Those words have meanings. They can be known by anybody that's willing to try to learn them. And they can only mean what they meant in the day they were written. They've tried so desperately to change and spin and modify and revise what the words mean, but they can only mean what they meant in 1787 when they were written. They can't mean anything else. So, we've had a lot of unconstitutional laws that have been written. We got to expunge those. And we could talk at length about some of the ways to do that, and nullification's one of them, and that's something a lot of people are terrified of, but we don't have time to talk about tonight. But we've got to regain our understanding of what's constitutionally sound. We must study it in the tradition of the Founding Fathers. Then we've got to insist that our representatives keep all their actions within those bounds, and we've got to have a courageous, bold action. And the Constitution Party has got to take a leadership role in that. As I said earlier, I was so pleased. We had over 200,000 people that consciously chose a path that would have restored that Constitution. Most of the other nation consciously chose to look for something that the establishment, now in spite of what most of us understand is happening with Mr. Trump, they thought he was an outsider that was going to change the path the nation was on. And as we can see from his appointments and everything, I suspect we're going to be highly disappointed. But we've got to gather those people, those millions of people that express their desire for change, and let's help them come to understand that the back trail's good. We can find it. I'm here today to prove that there is a way back. Yeah, I left the Republicans, but also when I was 6, I found my way back too. But the fact of the matter is, this party has to, by definition, hang with this. And if we're unwilling to do that, I pray for this nation. But I again think of that debate that happened about Sodom and Gomorrah. We've got a lot of good people on our side. We've just got to seek them out and bring them again. So I'll just show you how to get in touch with me. Check out, I've got a card back there. I got ways you can look at the website. Some of this is back there. But we do have just a few, if you wanted me to keep it within an hour, I got 10 minutes left. But I hurried through, by the way. There was a lot more I could have and should have said. Randy has a point, and I think there's 4 things we can do to win this country back, really. And then I probably ought to sit down because I'm almost up to my hour. Well, it was 2, wasn't it, Frank? No. Anyway, the first thing I really truly believe is we've got to get right with God. I think that's an individual thing, then in families, then in congregations and communities, then in states, then in nations. And I think it's a task that needs to be undertaken again. The first chapter of my book is America's Spiritual Foundation. We were born spiritually as a nation before we existed as this grand and glorious power on earth today. And the people, and that I build that case in my book. But at any rate, that's the first thing. Get right with God. The second thing is we've got to understand these principles in the tradition of the Founding Fathers. We've got to read the Declaration. We've got to read the Constitution. We've got to read those things that were written and said by the founders, the Federalist Papers, St. George Tucker's view of the Constitution of the United States. We've got to be able to read their farewell addresses and understand them, internalize them. We've got to know them. And it's not hard to do. If somebody as simple-minded as me can do that, anybody can do it. The third thing we've got to do is we've got to get involved. We've got to engage ourselves in this. And whether it's running for an office or it's helping pay for somebody to run, whether it's writing letters, I don't know, you're going to have to find out what your position is on this thing. And then the fourth thing we've got to do is we've got to help others get involved. And it all has to be done in my way, in a kind of a Christ-like godly way that, we don't convert by the sword. We don't. There's some religions out there that try and do that. And that's not Christ's way. It's by gentleness and meekness, love unfeigned, patience and long-suffering. We've got to use that approach, and I think, Randy, you're saying that, is that we need to come across in a way that we're not grabbing them by the cheeks and pounding our forehead into theirs. We've got to help them convert to this because they want to. And if we do those 4 things, I think we'll be able to. I'll just close with a couple of statements here. One is, it's a disputed statement that was made by George Washington at the beginning of the convention. There's a number of highly regarded people that believe he said it, but it's not in Madison's works, but Gouverneur Morris, who was there at the convention, said he said it. Okay, so Madison didn't capture it in his notes, but here's what he has said that he said. If to please the people we offer what we ourselves disapprove, how can we afterwards defend our work? Let us raise a standard to which the wise and the honest can repair. The event is in the hands of God. Okay, now the Constitution Party is small in number, but our passion, our spirit, our commitment, our devotion, our fervor, all of that can make this really come together. And then the last thing to maybe state on this is another statement by George Washington, and this is well documented. There is but one straight course, and that is to seek truth and pursue it steadily. And if we can ratify that concept in our minds and seek diligently, faithfully, devotedly to stay on that path, whatever else comes along, at least I think when the Savior returns, there's a better chance that we'll be standing with him at that time, because I really believe the cause of liberty is his cause. Truth and liberty go right hand in hand together. So I'm sorry it wasn't a pep rally that I led tonight, but I think that we can know that this foundation is sound and we can go forward. We don't have to apologize, and we can win if we're devotedly faithful in this thing. So thank you very much for everything you do.